Welcome. I'd really appreciate if you could drop a comment with your thoughts and reactions as you listen. Your feedback helps me craft better stories for you. Miranda stared blankly at her laptop screen, the glow of the web page casting her face in an eerie blue light. She had been aimlessly browsing the dark web for over an hour, clicking from one unsettling site to the next in a bored haze. Most of it was the usual disturbing fare: illegal markets, gore forums, conspiracy theories. Nothing that could hold her interest for long. She scrolled down, scanning for anything intriguing enough to pique her curiosity when a strange link caught her eye: 7 deadly sins. Intrigued, Miranda clicked on it, not knowing what to expect from such an ominous name. The page loaded slowly, as if reluctant to reveal its secrets. When it finally appeared, she saw only a simple message: choose your sin. Below were 7 options, each labeled with a different sin: lust, gluttony, greed, sloth, wrath, envy, and pride. Miranda hesitated, unsettled by the sinister vibe the site gave off. Yet her boredom won out over caution. After a moment's thought, she selected lust, half expecting some depraved video to play. Instead, a new message flashed on screen: your choice has been recorded. Consequences will follow. Miranda laughed nervously, assuming it was just a lame attempt at an edgy web design. She shut her laptop and tried to forget about it, focusing on her schoolwork for the rest of the evening. 2 days passed uneventfully until Miranda received a text from her ex Sam asking to meet. Curious, she agreed, and they arranged to grab coffee that afternoon. When Sam didn't show up, she assumed he'd flaked out as usual. But later that night, she got a call from the police. Sam and their mutual friend Gina had been found brutally murdered in his apartment, their mutilated bodies barely recognizable. Miranda felt her world spin out of control as the officer's words echoed in her head. She stumbled to the bathroom and vomited, overcome with horror and grief. Once she had somewhat composed herself, Miranda booted up her laptop with shaking hands, dreading what she might find. Sure enough, a new message awaited on the dark website. The consequences of lust have been delivered. Choose your next sin or face the same fate. Miranda stared in disbelief. This had to be a sick coincidence or some deranged prank. Yet a cold feeling gripped her heart as she recalled the site's ominous warning. With trembling fingers, she clicked on wrath, feeling she had no choice if she wanted to stay alive. The message changed. Your choice has been recorded. The game has begun. Miranda slammed her laptop shut, backing away as if it had come to life to threaten her. Her mind raced with panic and confusion, trying to make sense of the impossible events. Sam and Gina couldn't really be dead because of some stupid website, could they? She must be losing her mind from the trauma. Yet over the next few days, strange things began to happen that suggested she was being watched. Cryptic notes left in her locker hinted someone was always nearby, just out of sight. And when she returned home that evening, Miranda found an envelope taped to her front door containing gruesome crime scene photos of her friends' mutilated corpses. She screamed and threw the envelope away, collapsing against the wall as waves of nausea and terror overwhelmed her. This wasn't a prank anymore. Someone truly dangerous had fixated on her through that cursed dark website. Miranda realized with dawning horror that she was trapped in a sinister game with no way out, and the next move was not hers to choose. Miranda sat in her intro to psychology class the next day, struggling to focus through her exhaustion and fear. All night, she had tossed and turned, tormented by nightmares of Sam and Gina's brutalized bodies. Each time she closed her eyes, the gruesome crime scene photos seemed burned into her mind. As the professor droned on about classical conditioning, Miranda stared blankly at her notebook, unable to take notes through the haze of panic clouding her thoughts. What if the killer was in this very room, watching her every move, She glanced furtively around at her classmates, wondering if one of them could be the depraved monster pulling her strings. Just then, her phone buzzed in her pocket. Miranda froze, dreading what new horror the message might contain. With trembling hands, she slipped it out and opened the text, bracing herself. It was a photo attachment. Miranda hesitated, then tapped it with reluctance. The image flashed up on her screen, and she stifled a scream, dropping the phone in shock. It showed her friend Grace tied to a chair, gagged and sobbing in fear, as a figure in a dark hood loomed over her, knife glinting. The caption read, "Choose greed or she dies. You have 1 hour." Miranda scrambled to pick up her phone, heart pounding. She glanced around furtively, but the other students seemed oblivious to her panic, absorbed in their own worlds. With shaking hands, she typed out a response, begging for Grace's life and promising to choose the next sentence. A message pinged back immediately. 1 hour. The clock is ticking. Miranda bolted out of class, ignoring the professor's shouts. She raced to her car and sped towards Grace's apartment, praying she wasn't too late. Her mind swirled with confusion and guilt. How had the killer known Grace, found where she lived, unless he had been watching Miranda far more closely than she realized? She arrived at the apartment building in record time and sprinted up the stairs, banging on Grace's door hysterically. When no one answered, Miranda tried the handle. It opened, unlocked. She stepped inside with dread. "Grace," Miranda called out shakily. No response. The apartment was eerily silent. She searched every room with mounting panic, finding no sign of her friend. But in Grace's bedroom, Miranda spotted a folded note on the pillow. Trembling, she picked it up and read the scrawled message. "Tick-tock. Choose or she's dead. You have 30 minutes left." Miranda let out an anguished sob, crumpling to her knees as despair washed over her. Grace was gone, taken by the monster holding all the cards in this depraved game. With no other choice, Miranda logged onto the dark web with shaking hands and selected greed. The message changed immediately. "Your choice has been recorded. Now let the real fun begin." A link appeared below, leading to a live video feed. Miranda clicked it hesitantly and gasped at the gruesome scene. Grace was strapped to a metal table, thrashing and screaming through her gag as the hooded figure slowly carved into her flesh with a bone saw. Miranda watched in horror, paralyzed, as Grace's tortured screams faded to wet gurgles. Finally, her strangled movements ceased. The figure leaned over her mutilated corpse and stared straight into the camera, bloodied saw glinting. "You're next," a distorted voice whispered. The feed cut out. Miranda sat frozen in shock. The horrific image seared into her mind. Grace was dead because of her, because she had chosen to play this depraved killer's game, not realizing there was no way to win. Now he had made it clear. She was his ultimate target all along, and he would stop at nothing to claim her as his next victim. Miranda sat huddled in her room for days after Grace's murder, too traumatized to function. She barely ate or slept, replaying the gruesome video feed on an endless loop in her mind. The police had questioned her but found no leads, the killer having expertly covered his tracks. All the while, Miranda felt his ominous presence lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike again. She knew he wouldn't be satisfied until he had finished what he started. By claiming her life in the most brutal way possible, the realization sent her spiraling further into panic and despair. On the third day, there was a knock at her door. Miranda froze, too terrified to answer, imagining the hooded killer had finally come to end her. But then a muffled voice called out, "Miranda, it's Daniel. Please open up. I'm worried about you." Daniel was her childhood friend who lived next door. After much hesitation, Miranda unlocked the door and let him in with trembling hands. He took one look at her gaunt, haunted face and pulled her into a tight hug. "What happened to you?" Daniel asked gently. "I heard about Grace. The police have no leads, but you must know something to be this shaken up." Miranda broke down, pouring out the whole horrific story between sobs. The dark website, the sinister messages, witnessing Grace's brutal murder on livestream. Daniel listened in stunned silence, struggling to believe such evil could exist. "I think he's targeting everyone close to me," Miranda said shakily, "to torment me before the final act. You shouldn't be here. You're in danger too, now that you know." Daniel took her hands firmly. "I'm not going anywhere. We'll figure this out together, okay? Let me do some digging online. There has to be a clue about who this sicko is." Despite her protests, Miranda was relieved not to face this alone anymore. That night, she finally slept for a few fitful hours, comforted by Daniel's presence next door. The next morning, Miranda woke to the sound of sirens. Dreading what she might find, she crept outside to see police cars swarming Daniel's house. Her worst fears were confirmed when 2 officers approached solemnly. "I'm afraid there's been another murder," one said gently. "We found Daniel in his room. It was a very brutal attack. I'm sorry for your loss." Miranda let out an anguished wail and collapsed against the officer as her world shattered further. Daniel, her oldest friend, was now dead because of her, because he had tried to help uncover the monster hunting her. Through her tears, Miranda noticed a folded note on the ground addressed to her. With shaking hands, she opened it, already knowing what she would find. A single sentence was scrawled inside. "You're alone now. There's no one left to save you." Miranda crumpled the note, consumed with grief, guilt, and utter terror. The killer had eliminated anyone who could help or protect her, whittling down his prey with clinical precision. And now, with no one standing in his way, he was clearly coming for the grand finale, her brutal death. She was completely at his mercy in this twisted game. Miranda knew she couldn't wait passively any longer for the killer to make his next move. She had to take the fight to him before it was too late. After much deliberation, Miranda devised a desperate plan. She would post online claiming to have discovered the killer's true identity. With any luck, he couldn't resist coming after her to ensure his secret stayed buried. That evening, Miranda logged onto the dark web and typed a chilling message on the 7 Deadly Sins site. "I know who you are. Your sick games end tonight." She hit post and then sat back, heart pounding as she waited for a reaction. Minutes ticked by with no response. Had he seen it yet? Was he watching even now? Rage and panic building as his twisted fantasies began to unravel. Just as doubt started to creep in, Miranda's phone buzzed. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" a distorted voice hissed. "But you have no idea what you've unleashed. I'm coming for you, Miranda. And this time, there will be no mercy." The line went dead. Miranda's blood ran cold. Her plan had worked. But now she would have to face the monster alone, with no one left to help her. Night fell as she paced her apartment, jumping at every small sound. Around midnight, she heard the faintest of clicks from the front door. He was here. Miranda grabbed the only weapon she could find, a kitchen knife, and hid behind the couch, barely breathing in the suffocating silence. Then she saw it, a dark shadow slipping into the room. With a scream of rage and terror, Miranda leapt out and lunged at the figure. They grappled violently, exchanging blows as Miranda slashed wildly with the knife. She caught a glimpse of the killer's hooded face and froze in shock. It was someone she knew, someone who had been hiding in plain sight this whole time. In her moment of hesitation, the killer disarmed Miranda and threw her to the ground, pinning her wrists above her head. She stared up in horror at the familiar face, now twisted with depraved glee. "You really thought you could outsmart me," he hissed. "But I've always been one step ahead, watching your every move. And now it's time for our game to reach its climax." Miranda thrashed desperately as the killer retrieved the knife, raising it high with a crazed gleam. This was it. Her gruesome death. Her gruesome death was mere seconds away. She screwed her eyes shut, bracing for the searing pain. Suddenly, Miranda heard a crash and the weight lifted off her. She opened her eyes to chaos. The killer was now grappling with another figure, the two rolling around in a blur of fists and curses. With a sickening crack, the intruder went limp. Miranda's savior rose unsteadily and pulled off their mask. She gasped in disbelief. "Daniel, but you can't be." He smiled wearily. "It's over now. I faked my death to draw him out, and it worked. He can't hurt you anymore." Daniel collapsed into Miranda's arms, just as police sirens wailed in the distance. It was finally over. Miranda sat in the hospital waiting room, numb with shock as the events of the past night replayed in her mind. Daniel had survived, though barely. He was now in emergency surgery after nearly being beaten to death. The police had arrested the real killer, whose identity still sent chills down Miranda's spine. As for her, the doctors said she had suffered no physical injuries, but the psychological trauma might take far longer to heal, if it ever did. A detective approached Miranda now, expression grim. "We got a full confession. I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but it was your ex, Sam." Miranda stared in disbelief. "That's not possible. Sam is dead. I saw the crime scene photos." The detective sighed. Those photos were faked. It was all part of his elaborate ruse to torment you. See, Sam was always obsessed with you, even after the breakup. When you chose lust on that dark website, it sent him over the edge. Miranda's mind reeled as the pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. He killed Gina and staged it all to frame someone else, so he could contact me pretending to be the victim. Then he started killing my friends one by one for sins, to break me down slowly before the final act. The detective nodded grimly. Sam had been planning it all very carefully, watching your every move both online and offline. But in the end, his ego got the better of him. He couldn't resist coming after you himself to ensure you died by his hand. Miranda broke down in tears as the full twisted scope of Sam's depraved scheme was revealed. All along, the killer had been someone she knew and trusted, someone who used her darkest browsing habits to craft the perfect trap and enact a psychopath's revenge. In the following days, Miranda slowly began to process the trauma as best she could. Daniel recovered from his injuries and was there to support her through the worst of the nightmares. As for Sam, he would spend the rest of his life locked away in an asylum for the criminally insane. Though the physical threat was over, Miranda knew she might never fully escape the lingering shadows of what Sam had put her through. His sins had scarred her deeply, in body and soul. All she could do was try to move forward, learn from her mistakes, and never let curiosity or boredom override caution again. Some games, it seemed, could never truly be survived unscathed, but with time and compassion, even the deepest wounds might begin to heal. Mark stared blankly at his computer screen, the cursor blinking mockingly as another job application went unfinished. 3 months had passed since losing his position at the accounting firm, and still no new opportunities had materialized. Bills were piling up as his meager savings dwindled to nothing. He rubbed tired eyes and leaned back in his chair, gazing around the sparse apartment that was becoming less a home each day. How had it all fallen apart so quickly? Just last year, he'd been on track for partnership. Now he was barely holding on. A notification pinged on his phone, pulling him from his spiraling thoughts. It was a message from his old colleague Dave, who must have heard of his troubles. "Hey man, heard you've been down on your luck. I know it's not your thing, but you should check out this site. Might take your mind off things for a bit." Intrigued, Mark opened the link. The dark web page loaded slowly on his outdated laptop. A nondescript logo greeted him, Below it, the words "experience true virtual torture." He scoffed. Was Dave pranking him? But his curiosity was piqued. As he scrolled further, descriptions of horrific acts appeared on the screen. Detailed accounts of torture, mutilation, even murder. Yet the page claimed it was all virtual. The characters merely You could subject them to any torment without consequences in the real world. A twisted form of role-playing, but safe and legal. Something about the clinical language drew Mark in, detached him from the gruesomeness. Here was a place to lose himself, if only for a little while. An escape from his failures, if only in fiction. He clicked the registration button without a second thought. The character creation process was straightforward. He chose a generic male avatar, gave it the name Simon, and was granted access to the character's profile. Basic stats like strength and endurance were listed, along with an inventory of torture devices. Mark hesitated, mouse hovering over the start button, then steeled himself. It was all make-believe after all. In his first session, he selected a simple beating with a club to get a feel for the interface. Basic prompts appeared. You wind up and strike Simon across the back. He cries out in pain. The realism was startling. Simon's pixelated avatar writhed on the floor, begging for mercy in a disturbingly human voice. Mark paused, unsettled, but he told himself it wasn't real, pressing on to inflict new levels of damage. By the end of the hour-long session, Simon had suffered more abuse than any one person could withstand. Yet, according to the site, the character felt no permanent harm. Mark logged off, exhausted yet strangely energized by the rush of power. It had been cathartic in its way, taking control where he had none in his real life. And Simon would be good as new next time. That night, Mark's dreams were plagued by Simon's screams. He tossed and turned, waking in a cold sweat to find the sounds still echoing in his mind. Grasping for calm, he told himself it meant nothing. Simon was lines of code, programmed to elicit a response, but feeling no true pain. The site's designers were simply skilled at immersion. In the days that followed, Mark found himself returning to the site obsessively. Each session grew darker as he pushed the boundaries of what he was willing to inflict. Soon, simple beatings weren't enough to satisfy the itch under his skin. He began experimenting with tools from the expanded inventory. Whips, blades, even fire. Through it all, Simon endured with disturbing resilience. His avatar took on a gaunt, haunted look, yet he continued pleading for an end to his torment. The realism unsettled Mark, gnawing at his conscience each time he logged on. Flashes of their sessions invaded his waking hours, Simon's cries merging seamlessly with everyday sounds. He started researching the site more closely, scanning the dark corners of the web for any information on its creators and technology. That's when he found the first discrepancies in its story. Reports from forensic computer experts claimed such advanced AI was still decades away. Code that sophisticated should have left traces, but none could be found. Doubt took root in Mark's mind like a spreading cancer. What if Simon wasn't code at all? What if behind those pixels was something, or someone, experiencing very real pain? The idea was too horrible to entertain. Yet it fit too well with all the site had awakened in him, a dark compulsion he didn't fully understand, and an obsession that now demanded answers rather than temporary release. Mark had to know the truth behind the rabbit hole, whatever it might reveal. Flashes of Simon's torture continued to haunt Mark's dreams. Each night he relived the sessions in vivid detail, Simon's cries cutting through him with new force. By day, his research consumed him, scouring the dark corners of the internet for any clue to the site's true nature. He found scattered reports from others who had used the service, their stories mirroring his own growing unease. Descriptions too lifelike, reactions too human to be simulated, but most dismissed it as a particularly immersive form of roleplay. Only a few voiced the doubts gnawing at Mark. yet none had pursued the truth as far as he now was. Tracking the site's infrastructure led him to a man calling himself Dr. Walsh, who had come up in records of its original registration years ago. All other traces of the creator were expertly covered, but Mark was certain Walsh held the answers and was now the only lead left to follow. He arranged a meeting under false pretenses, claiming to be a researcher seeking the technology behind their AI. The nondescript warehouse they chose did little to ease Mark's nerves as he pulled up outside. Taking a steadying breath, he entered, ready for confrontation. The sparse, sterile interior gave no hints to the true purpose within its walls. A lone figure sat waiting, rising calmly to greet Mark with an oily smile. "Dr. Walsh, I presume. I appreciate you meeting on such short notice." "Not at all. It's always a pleasure to discuss our work. Please, have a seat." Walsh's tone was polite, yet carried an undercurrent that set Mark further on edge. "I understand you're interested in our virtual characters. Impressive, are they not?" Mark nodded cautiously. "Very lifelike. That's what drew me in. Though upon further examination, some aspects don't quite add up. Your code is far more advanced than anything publicly available." Walsh chuckled softly. "You've done your research, I see." "Yes. Creating fully immersive virtual beings has proven challenging. Traditional coding falls short of replicating true human essence." A chill ran through Mark at the implication. "So the characters, they're not virtual at all, are they?" "Perceptive. No. For years, I've been conducting experiments with human subjects, studying the limits of pain, fear, even breaking the mind itself. All in the name of scientific progress, of course." Walsh's eyes gleamed with an unhinged fervor that sent Mark's instincts screaming. "You're torturing real people, keeping them imprisoned somewhere." Horror and revulsion warred within at the confirmation of his worst fears. Now, I prefer to think of it as long-term behavioral modification, and it's yielded remarkable insights. Wouldn't you agree?" Walsh gestured to Mark as if expecting praise for his monstrosity. "This is insane, inhumane." Mark rose on shaking legs, backing away slowly. "I have to go to the authorities. Get them to shut this place down." Walsh's polite veneer cracked, eyes flashing with menace. "I'm afraid I can't let you do that. You see, loose ends threaten the integrity of my work. And we've come so far." Before Mark could react, Walsh lunged at him with inhuman speed. A sharp pain exploded in his neck as a syringe plunged deep. His legs gave out as the world spun into darkness. When consciousness returned, Mark found himself in a dimly lit cell. Cold stone walls closed in from all sides. The lone steel door locked firmly shut. Panic rose in his chest until he forced calm, taking stock of his situation. He appeared unharmed, though a lingering grogginess and headache remained from whatever drug Walsh had used. Faint sounds filtered through the walls. Pained moans, pleading whispers that sent a fresh wave of guilt crashing over him. The others, the real people whose suffering he'd unwittingly enabled, were close by, suffering untold torments. And he was trapped with them, at the mercy of a psychopath who would stop at nothing to continue his depraved experiments. Mark sank to the floor, head in hands, as the full horror of his descent finally hit home. All he'd done, all he'd unleashed, had been devastatingly real. And now, there may be no escaping the darkness. Chapter 3. Facing Darkness. The desperate escape. Time had no meaning in the featureless cell. Mark lost track of how long he paced the narrow confines like a caged animal, searching desperately for any weakness in the solid walls. Occasional muffled screams still echoed down the corridor, a grim reminder of the torture continuing unchecked above. Exhaustion and hunger eventually overwhelmed him into fitful sleep. When he woke, a tray of meager rations had been slid through the bottom of the door. He ate ravenously, then resumed his vigil for any sign of the outside world. Hours or days may have passed before the first voice finally reached him. "Hello, is someone else in there?" The words were hoarse, yet carried an air of forced calm. Mark rushed to the door. "Yes, I'm here. My name's Mark." A weary sigh of relief. "I'm Claire." He recounted the events that led to his imprisonment as best he could, leaving out the full extent of his own sins. Claire listened in silence, then told her own story of being kidnapped off the street months ago. They continued talking whenever possible, finding solace in each other's company against the darkness. Through their conversations, Mark pieced together the horrific scope of Walsh's depraved experiments over the years. Dozens had disappeared without a trace, their fates now tragically clear. Days blended into an endless cycle of fear and waiting, until a commotion outside broke the routine. Heavy footsteps approached, followed by the jangling of keys in Mark's lock. He scrambled back just as the door swung open to reveal Walsh's hulking form filling the entrance. "Time for your session, I think. Can't have you getting too comfortable down here." Walsh lunged with shocking speed, but Mark was ready. He dodged and drove his shoulder into the larger man's midsection, sending them both crashing into the opposite wall. They grappled fiercely, years of pent-up rage, fueling Mark's strength against Walsh's bulk. But the scientist was still physically superior, slowly gaining the upper hand. Mark spotted the ring of keys on Walsh's belt just before a meaty fist connected with his jaw, stars exploding across his vision. Through the haze of pain, he heard Claire's muffled shouts from the next cell. It spurred him to redouble his efforts, fighting like a cornered animal for even the slimmest chance of escape. His fingers closed around the keys, yanking them free just as Walsh slammed him to the floor. With his last reserves of will, Mark drove the keys up in a vicious jab. Walsh howled, reeling back, clutching his eye socket as dark blood welled between his fingers. Mark scrambled up and kicked out with all his might, connecting solidly between the man's legs. Walsh crumpled without another sound. Mark stood panting, keys clenched tight as adrenaline coursed through him. He had to act fast before Walsh recovered. "Claire, stand back. I'm getting you out." The first key he tried turned smoothly in the lock. Claire emerged gaunt and shaking, eyes widening at the scene before her. "Hurry, help me find the others." They moved from cell to cell, freeing prisoners in various states of trauma and malnourishment. A man named Daniel volunteered to help carry the weakest. They gathered what supplies they could carry, food, water, basic medical aid, and made their way through the maze of tunnels as quietly as possible. Mark led based on vague memories of his arrival, praying they weren't too disoriented to find the exit. After what felt like hours of sneaking through the twisting underground complex, a faint glow appeared ahead. Mark signaled for silence, creeping forward to peer around the corner. The warehouse entrance stood open to the night sky, no guards in sight. Had luck finally turned in their favor? He motioned the others to follow, breaking into a limping run for the open doorway. Fresh air hit them like a slap, the first real taste of freedom in what had become an eternity below. But they weren't safe yet. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer by the second as Walsh no doubt raised the alarm. Mark scanned the area frantically for any means of escape. An old pickup truck sat haphazardly parked near the back, keys still in the ignition. "Everyone, get in. We've got to put as much distance as possible between us and this place." They piled into the truck, Mark slamming it into gear and punching the accelerator. Gravel flew as they fishtailed onto the dirt road, leaving the hellish compound in the rearview mirror under cover of darkness. For now, they were free, but lingering shadows still haunted them all. And somewhere out there, Walsh's insidious work may yet continue in new forms, unless its roots could finally be torn out for good. Jake scrolled through the DarkWeb forum, eyes scanning each cryptic post for potential leads. As a tech journalist, it was his job to uncover the hidden dangers lurking in the shadows of the internet. But some corners were darker than others. That's when he saw it. A brief mention of a new livestream with an unsettling title, The Digital Dungeon. Curiosity got the better of him and Jake clicked the anonymous link. What loaded made his blood run cold. On screen, 3 figures were strapped to chairs in a bare concrete room. Their faces were obscured, but their anguished cries echoed in surround sound. A hooded figure paced between them, brandishing a knife that glinted under harsh LED lights. Jake watched in horror as the knife slashed across an arm, drawing a thin line of blood. The victim screamed and thrashed against their bonds to no avail. A second cut, deeper this time. Then the figure moved on, repeating the process with chilling efficiency on the others. This couldn't be real. Jake told himself it was special effects, just shock content meant to garner DarkWeb notoriety. But a small, sickening part of him knew the truth. He had to find where the stream originated and shut it down before the depravity escalated further. Tracing the stream back through layers of encryption and proxy servers took Jake deep into the night. Code snippets and IP addresses flashed by in a blur as his fingers flew across the keyboard. Finally, a location pinged. Jake arrived at dawn, the dilapidated buildings looming like shadows against the paling sky. He picked the lock of a rusted chain-link gate and slipped inside, flashlight beam cutting through the mist. Weeds had overrun what was once a parking lot, their brittle forms whispering ominously in the breeze. The largest structure ahead was a factory-like building, with shattered windows and peeling signage too faded to read. Jake entered cautiously, breathing through his mouth against the musty smell. Inside, the cavernous space was filled with rubble and rusting machinery. A thick layer of dust covered the concrete floor, undisturbed except for a set of boot prints, leading to an open maintenance hatch. Jake crouched and shone his light down the metal ladder, heart pounding. This had to be it, the entrance to whatever hell awaited below. Gripping the rungs, Jake descended into the gloom. The ladder went on for what seemed like an eternity until his feet hit solid ground with an echoing thud. He found himself in a narrow tunnel hewn from raw earth, lit only by the circle of light from his trembling flashlight. Jake started down the tunnel, the hairs on his neck standing on end. Strange symbols had been etched into the dirt walls, their meaning unfathomable. He picked up his pace, wanting nothing more than to uncover the source of the stream and get out. But then a noise made him freeze. Footsteps approaching from up ahead. Panic seized Jake and he ducked into an alcove, extinguishing his light. Heavy boots clomped nearer through the darkness until a hooded figure emerged into view, dragging a limp body by its arms. Jake stifled a gasp. It was one of the stream's victims, eyes closed and skin deathly pale. The figure hauled the body past without noticing Jake pressed against the wall. He waited an eternity for the sounds to fade before daring to breathe again. This place was real, and far more sinister than he could have imagined. Jake had to find out how deep the rabbit hole went before it was too late for the others still trapped down here. Reigniting his light with a shaking hand, Jake continued cautiously along the tunnel. It soon opened into a larger underground chamber hewn from bedrock. More symbols covered the walls, along with strange diagrams and equations scrawled in red. A set of heavy steel doors stood ajar at the far end, beyond which faint screams and pleas for mercy echoed. Jake's instincts screamed at him to turn back, but he had to see, had to know the truth. Gripping his flashlight like a weapon, he crept towards the doors. Peering through the crack, Jake's light fell upon a scene from his worst nightmares. The 3 captives from the stream were strapped to metal slabs, thrashing weakly as masked figures in lab coats sliced into their flesh. Blood and viscera coated stainless steel trays, the acrid smell making Jake gag. A hooded man paced between the slabs, observing the procedures with a clinical eye. His cold gaze fell upon Jake, and their eyes met through the crack. Jake stumbled back with a strangled yell, tripping over himself in his haste to flee as booted footsteps pounded towards the doors. He scrambled back the way he came in a blind panic, flashlight beam dancing wildly over the walls. A roar echoed behind him as the doors crashed open, releasing an unholy shriek. Jake poured on more speed, though his legs burned, feet pounding the earth. A shadow loomed ahead, and Jake swerved just in time to avoid colliding with a massive hooded figure, blocking the tunnel. He threw himself to the side with a cry, tumbling down a sloping chute and landing hard in a pool of fetid water. His light went out on impact, and darkness swallowed him whole. Jake lay there gasping, every muscle screaming in protest. Slowly, his eyes adjusted to the dim blue glow emanating from patches of fungus on the low ceiling. He was in some kind of natural cave formation. The chute he fell through, disappearing high above. Footsteps approached the chute's entrance, echoing dully. Jake held his breath. Praying the darkness concealed him, after an agonizing moment, the footsteps retreated back up the tunnel. He let out a shaky sigh of relief. For now, he was safe, but trapped underground in this living nightmare with no way out. Jake was in far over his head. He had to get help, warn others what was happening in the depths below. But first, he needed to escape this maze of tunnels and uncover who or what was truly pulling the strings of this depraved operation. Little did Jake know, the worst was yet to come. Jake didn't know how long he lay there, listening to the echoing drips of water and his own ragged breathing. His body ached all over from the fall, yet he dared not move, not while those monsters still prowled above. Eventually, hunger and thirst drove him to risk searching for a way out. Jake pulled himself to his feet using the cave walls for support, wincing as pain shot through his ankle. He took a few experimental steps, relieved to find it wasn't broken, just badly sprained. Using the faint glow, moss as a guide, Jake picked his way through the twisting natural tunnels. Strange rock formations loomed out of the shadows, taking on ominous shapes in his frazzled state of mind. Echoes played tricks as well. Was that a drip or distant footsteps closing in? Jake quickened his pace, ignoring the protest of his injured ankle. The tunnels seemed to stretch on endlessly, doubling back on themselves at every turn. He was lost, alone in this endless maze with no escape, and his pursuers still out there. Panic rose like bile in his throat. A glint in the darkness ahead made Jake freeze. Slowly, cautiously, he approached the source, a rusted metal hatch set into the cave wall. His heart soared. It had to lead back to the surface. Jake threw his weight against the hatch, but it didn't budge, sealed shut by decades of corrosion. He searched desperately for another way out to no avail. Trapped once more, the walls seemed to close in with a life of their own. Jake sank to the ground, drawing his knees to his chest as despair overwhelmed him. How long before those monsters sniffed him out down here? Time lost all meaning as Jake drifted in and out of an exhausted, fitful doze. When he opened his eyes again, a faint blue glow emanated from the tunnel ahead. His first thought was the glow moss, but this light was steadier, artificial. Jake scrambled to his feet, hope and dread warring within. Creeping towards the light on unsteady legs, Jake peered around the tunnel bend. Before him lay an expansive underground cavern, its high ceiling lost to shadows. Harsh LED lights illuminated a sprawling encampment of tents and equipment. Figures in hooded robes milled about, some hunched over laptops or clutching clipboards. A larger tent stood at the cavern's center, its entrance flanked by armed guards. Jake watched from the shadows, mind reeling. How big was this operation? A commotion arose as two robed figures dragged a struggling victim from the central tent. Jake recognized the man at once. It was Dr. Harris, a renowned neuroscientist who'd gone missing weeks ago. His lab coat was torn and face gaunt with exhaustion. The guards forced Dr. Harris to his knees before a hooded man who emerged from the tent. "Please, I've told you everything I know," Dr. Harris begged. "Let me go back to my family." The hooded man regarded him coldly before drawing a pistol. Jake lurched forward with a strangled cry before he could stop himself. All eyes turned in his direction as the shot rang out, echoing endlessly. Dr. Harris collapsed to the dirt, a crimson bloom staining his white coat. Jake scrambled back the way he came, boots pounding the earth. Shouts and footsteps pursued him into the twisting tunnels. He had to get help, warn the outside world of the horrors unfolding in the depths. But first, he had to escape this labyrinth and the monsters hunting him within its walls. Up ahead, a faint glow beckoned, the rusted hatch from before. Jake threw his weight against it with a scream of effort, ignoring the searing pain in his ankle. Rust and dirt rained down as ancient bolts sheared away. With a final groan, the hatch burst open, spilling him out into blinding daylight. Jake lay blinking on a barren hillside, the hatch built into the earth behind. He had made it out, escaping the darkness below. But for how long? Sirens wailed in the distance, growing nearer by the second, as Jake dragged himself towards the sound on hands and knees. 2 patrol cars screeched to a halt beside him, officers piling out with weapons drawn. "Please, help," Jake gasped before collapsing into blissful unconsciousness. When he awoke again, he was in a sterile hospital room surrounded by police. The officers questioned Jake intently about the underground complex and its inhabitants. He recounted all he had witnessed through a haze of painkillers, the stream, the captives, Dr. Harris' execution. They didn't believe him at first, thinking he was delusional from trauma. But a 9 unit was dispatched to the hatch's location and picked up a scent, leading the dogs into a frenzied search of the surrounding hills. Within hours, penetrating radar detected the vast network of tunnels stretching for miles in all directions. The police raided the encampment at dusk, catching many robed figures off guard. A fierce firefight ensued as the cultists fought to defend their lair, but were eventually overwhelmed. In the central tent, a shrine was found along with files containing names, photos, and notes on various missing persons. Jake watched the news coverage from his hospital bed, relief and residual fear warring within. The ringleader had escaped in the chaos, but many cultists were in custody, spilling disturbing details under interrogation. Their organization, called the Order, had been kidnapping and experimenting on victims for decades. Dr. Harris, it seemed, was one of their top scientists, working to develop methods of psychological and biological control until a crisis of conscience drove him to flee. His knowledge was too valuable to let slip away, so the Order hunted him down with ruthless efficiency. As for the stream, it was merely one twisted facet of the Order's plans to spread fear and influence through the darkest corners of the internet. Their endgame, pieced together from cryptic journal entries, involved unleashing some new form of control over the masses. But for now, the threat had been contained. The tunnels were being excavated and searched for any remaining captives. Jake knew, though, that this was only the beginning. The true mastermind behind the Order still evaded capture, and their depraved experiments hinted at ambitions that went far beyond one underground complex. As Jake drifted into a fitful sleep, questions lingered heavy in his mind. Who was pulling the strings, and what other horrors were still out there waiting to be uncovered? The nightmare was over for now, but in the digital age, evil like this could fester and spread in the shadows, just beyond sight until it was too late to stop.